Welcome to the NTT Health and Wellbeing Podcast, a show exploring the digital transformation of our everyday welfare. On this episode, the COVID-19 pandemic has shattered the common conception of the workplace, fundamentally altering the way in which many of us lead our professional lives. To help chart a clear path forward for individuals and organizations alike, Alex Bennett, Global Senior Vice President, GTM Solutions with NTT Ltd, and Kevin Mulcahy, co-author of The Future Workplace Experience, examine the effect of digital transformation on productivity, collaboration, and professional satisfaction in the evolving workspace.
Kevin, thanks for joining us today. I think it'd be great just for everyone that's listening in to understand a little bit about your background. So if you can introduce yourself, that would be absolutely fantastic.
Well, thank you, and it's a delight to be here. Yes, Kevin Mulcahy, and the accent, you can detect it's an Irish accent, so there will be some various pronunciations of terms that you know and love well. Don't hold them against me. Co-author of a book, The Future Workplace Experience, and that was a book that was published pre-pandemic on trying to highlight some of the trends that reshape the workplace and the employee experience. And so looking forward to seeing how some of those trends, now that we've had a quote unquote shock to the system, are the trends viable or do some of the trends disappear? That's my focus. And I help a lot of companies anticipate trends that are reshaping the future of learning and working. And as always, people think about the future is some distant time. And what I always advocate is we're in the future now. We're shaping the future now. The actions and decisions that we make today shape our future. So what do we want our future to be in our workplaces?
I suppose, if we sort of jump into the first question, but if we then look at this sort of pandemic and what's happened and some of the marketing around this idea of remote and hybrid working, what's your views around perhaps what employees and individuals have actually gained out of that? Perhaps then we can come up and discuss what possibly they've lost as well.
What they've gained is a sense of autonomy and empowerment on choice. And a number of companies have realized that there is actually value in asking employees what they are comfortable with and what choices do they want to have or to make. And I think it's opened up the negotiation between employers and employees on the notion of choice and what choices are we comfortable offering to employees. And we can get into how that's manifested in terms of coming to the office and how many days in the office or where employees want to work, et cetera. But that's what I see as the big one. And the second big one is a lot of people had assumed that remote working was not applicable to many roles. And the pandemic has proven that many roles indeed are able to be conducted remotely, and what implications are there now that we're all re-entering back to our workplaces.
And it's been really interesting around this area where people have started to reevaluate what does work really mean to them, and this new way of what work really is. It's not a physical destination, but also about work-life balance. And it was interesting in the report that we actually did is that work-life balance was actually the top benefit to that new way of working, which we're terming hybrid. So Kevin, I just wanted to get your thoughts about that also.
Yes, thank you, Alex. You've brought up two fundamental issues that shape the employee experience right there. One is this emotional aspect. And for me, the emotional aspect is how can we as employers help employees feel more emotionally connected to their roles? And I think there's been a lot of revisiting of that during and post-pandemic is what is the company purpose and why am I working at this company? And reconnecting people with their sense of why and connecting their personal sense of why to the company's sense of why. Why are we here? What are we trying to accomplish? What mark are we trying to make in the world? And then the second element that you brought up was the idea of physical choices. And how do we provide choices on where and when employees can do their best work? And if we ask employees that open question, where do you do your best work and when? And we believe the answer, and we structure some policies to take advantage of those answers, then I think we're opening up a healthy negotiation on when and where employees can do their work.
That's that relationship bond where I think, trust and trustworthiness is so critical now. And I think with a lot of the companies that we are seeing succeeding in the market today, they've really focused on that engagement and communicating significantly and gaining feedback from their employees, and also understanding the sentiment of their employees about where they're wanting to go and what that purpose means to them, rather than necessarily by a job function, but almost getting down now more towards the personality traits and taking into consideration cultural and inclusiveness within that sort of strategy also. I'm not sure if you've seen that.
Yes, and actually you've brought in yet another factor, and that's cultural factor. The question for employers is, how can you foster the desired behaviors that you want from your employees at all levels? And a definition that I have of culture is essentially what's the worst behavior you're willing to tolerate. And that's actually the benchmark for culture, because culture is all how we do things around here, how we behave, how we treat each other. And if we don't lift what the worst behaviors are and raise that mark up, then that's how we raise culture. It's more than just aspirational culture, which are the values that we post on our walls of what we aspire to be, and we want to be A, we want to be B, we want to be C. Those are aspirational aspects of culture. But as we move back into the workplace, it's essentially akin to coming back from a really long sojourn from a college or back to our days of high school or secondary school. You're resetting the new norms and new behaviors for the new term or the new semester. And that's what we're entering, a new semester of work as everybody comes back. And we have to be sensitive to everybody's had a very different 18 months, and they're all coming back from very different places. They've had very different experiences. And we have to tolerate a renorming and a resetting of what's our shared experience going to be now that we're back, and how do we move forward in how we treat each other and how we interact with each other and how we behave and what we expect of each other and what we will not tolerate from each other. It's a great reset for culture.
And it's almost, I think it's setting more around sort of communities, whereas in the past you might have had, I think, more hierarchical view of communication, again, set by sort of policy. But as you've started to have this sort of position over the last 18 months where everyone has been located in different locations, you almost need to set up these sub-communities, even down to support groups of 5 or 6 people. We've seen with a number of clients where they'll actually touch in every day and just make sure people are getting on better, and making sure if they're not feeling well, be it mental wellness, physical wellness, or whatever else it may be, that there are people to actually communicate and to work into. And I think that almost speaks about that loss of what have people possibly lost over the last 18 months, and social interaction, learning, possible career progression, and just that sense of belonging, I think, is the conversation I'm having with a lot of organizations, and also, again, sort of dependent on culture, country, and age also.
Yes, so I think what we're seeing here is reframing the feeling of inclusivity and belonging. And how do we help our peers belong to the group or include them in the group? And one of the challenges on remote is that it is often more difficult to bring people together. And it has been exhausting to bring people together on Zoom calls where everybody's looking at each other. And what we've lost is the water cooler moments. And some of the firms that I've been talking to recently have put in, just on Fridays or Tuesdays or Mondays, a little 1-hour open space water cooler hours that are remote, join in, no agenda. We're just gathering to kick around the various open things that we would normally kick around if we met each other in the corridors in the office, and creating social time and social space in the online and digital environments. And the second element of that is people are scheduling some fun time. The other aspect is we used to gather together and go do something fun with people after work, go for a beer after work. And so how do we now create a sense of fun in a remote working environment? And if you just even put the question, I don't want to be in the solution offering business, but it's sometimes more useful to get at the right question. And then the solutions can be generated that are appropriate to each team. But how are we creating a sense of fun together? How do we want to have fun together in between our very productive meetings? And I think that's where people are examining now and doing all sorts of fun remote team building. One example that I saw recently was a team that got together and had a facilitated remote art class. And it allowed the team to just suspend the busyness in their minds of what the last emails were saying or what the prevailing issues were, and have some quiet space to coordinate and be together quietly doing something together that wasn't about work. That's the element we want to get to, is how do we come together and belong together and include ourselves in each other's space in a digital world.
Yeah, that's the interesting piece, because as 90% of organizations say they no longer see work just as a physical space. You're right, we've almost created an ability to perform an outcome in a digitized platform now, as technology has started to progress. But the reality is we're humans and we still want to connect, we still want to have fun. And by doing that, you do build rapport and connections with your colleagues, your partners, and more as you move towards a gig economy, that allows you to engage in a new way. And I think at the start of the pandemic, we saw feedback from a number of organizations that they felt innovation was quite difficult because people weren't quite used to doing design thinking not in a single room. Whereas now going forward, I think we're motivating for people to come back into a changed physical location, which is set up for that social interaction to create a view of innovation and interaction. But you're still probably going to have a few people who are going to need to come in remotely. So you've actually got the challenges of both going forward, right?
And the challenges of both going forward become amplified as the pace of returning to work differs by individual. So what we're seeing now is some people back at the conference room that we all know and love, and the conference room is half filled with those who are comfortable coming into the office at this time, and the other half of the spaces in the meeting are unfilled with people joining in remote. And we have to be very careful that we don't default back to the bad habits we had before when people dialed in remote, and not being sensitive to touching base with them and checking in with them to assure that they're not being left out of the conversation. And I hope that we don't forget the inclusive behaviors and habits of listening to each other as we were on our audio calls and our Zoom calls, and we made a better effort to hear from people at meetings when we were all remote, that we don't lose that skill as we rush back to the office and we default back to the 2019 skills of just not giving the folks that are on the remote call as much attention as to the people in the room.
The conversations I'm having around that, I think that's a real dilemma today, because I still believe a number of organizations are trying to motivate people to come back into a physical location and market what the benefit is there, and to make sure they're still then going to get that work-life balance and all of those sort of aspects of well-being. And that's about that human interaction, which you mentioned. But it's also, how do you start to quantify that? And that's the difficult thing. I think what I'm hearing is, unless you start to have some form of data that can give you science-based inputs to then be able to communicate, how do you show that this is really working and it's being supported? Because you're right. Otherwise, it comes back to, you've got to think about the personalities. If someone's introverted and they no longer come into the office and they're just going to sit at home, are you really extracting the most value out of that individual? Are they getting the most from that company? If you actually have data which shows 95% of the time that person is always working from home and isn't contributing necessarily to design thinking activities, how do you then start to nudge and give them sort of nudge technology to help them want to contribute more, or even do some level of change in the types of team dynamic and ask them to actually lead a meeting? And that moves into that sort of adoption and change management program as well.
Yes, and just to jump off of that idea of changing people's involvement, and you mentioned inviting them to lead a meeting. For me, it goes back to we're used to having people learn remotely, and I think if we evaluate the people on our team and we go, well, what does this team member have to teach the rest of us? And making sure that there's time for people to teach the rest of the team or showcase their knowledge and their projects, especially those that are working remotely, so that everybody has a role in teaching others, and that we make sure that people aren't just remote learners, but remote teachers. That's a great way to bring people in. When you're leading and teaching others, is a great way to bring remote people in and bring value from the folks that are remote.
To do that, I mean, you mentioned about systems and I mentioned about data. There's some fundamental sort of hygiene factors from a technology standpoint which needs to occur, because if someone can't actually connect into that meeting, it's very hard for them to be heard. There's really interesting data we've got, from clients we work with in South Africa, where you sometimes have load shedding, the network may go down. It becomes quite difficult. And if that continues to happen, then the personality traits are exacerbated if they're introverted. Well, why do I need to? I can't get the connection. So you almost need to make sure that the way in which organizations are moving from business continuity at the start of the pandemic to now thinking about the way in which work needs to happen, the network, be it inside of a physical location like an office, a remote work, co-working, or at home, always has to be available and good for people to then be able to connect and then start having conversations and then looking at that more human sort of nature and aspect of collaboration.
What I'm hearing in that is this balance between, when you talk about continuity, that's a preparedness mindset. It's a bounce back mindset versus a business resilience response, which is a leap forward, is a transformative mindset, is what's the new way of how we're going to do business post-pandemic? How are we going to enable our employees with the technology that they need and the training they need to use those technologies, and the tolerance if technology isn't working? For example, let's not insist on everybody having their cameras on in a Zoom meeting if somebody's dialing in from a low bandwidth area. It's this enabling people with the technologies that they feel that they can do their best work through. All our technologies that we have at home are not equal. And so there is I won't call it a burden on employers, but a responsibility on employers to check, do employees have the technology that they need, or the bandwidth or broadband that they need to be effective in remote working? And it's not just exasperating for the employee, but it's also exasperating for those that have to work for them and around them and with them. And making sure that we're just tolerant of what is the new way of doing business that we want to have post-pandemic, and what's the role that the technology choices and the training that we have on those technologies have on our productivity. And there's no point in dishing out remote technologies if people aren't trained in the using of them.
Yeah. Adoption and change is one of the biggest areas that we're sort of looking at today, because you can throw technology at everyone, but if they don't understand how to use it, what's the value to them as an individual or as a team, it just becomes yet another tool that sort of sits either on a computer desk or somewhere else, right? It's about, that goes back to that communication. And actually, see, this is one of the biggest gaps we've seen. One of the biggest areas we saw from our workplace report is about 3 in 4 of the CEOs stated that all of their strategy around modernizing and digitally optimizing, the way they were thinking about work was defined and agreed. But then the people who are actually implementing that in the operations, the IT team, and the change management teams, that was actually lower than half. So you're already getting to see a discrepancy between the executive team going, I know I've got to fund a different way of enabling our employees and of us as an organization, a technical debt level, or even just the reduction in the talent pool at the moment of people actually able to execute that. And then employees are saying, well, am I really happy in what I'm doing? Because I'm reevaluating what I want out of my life and how my work-life balance is going to happen, which is why 23% of the employees responded, said they're only very happy with their roles. Only 23% of them said that. So we're seeing at the moment this real discrepancy between different parts of organizations and what they really require.
And this one goes back to what results are we holding everybody to, and what's everybody's job? And one of my favorite sayings is everybody has the same job description, and your job is to help the company win in the marketplace. And there's a particular function that you hold to help us do that, but that's your job description, help us win in the marketplace. Now, what is it that you need to do your job? And there are some specifics that you need to do your role, but to help the company win, what barriers are getting in the way of you fulfilling that job description? And I think asking that question and framing that that's the job description, not to be a better X or a better Y or a better Z, but what do you need to help the company win? And the more barriers we can clear out and hear what people's barriers are, and then give managers a little latitude to solve for removing some of those barriers. Somebody talked to me recently. He says, I don't treat everybody equally. I treat everybody the same unequally because their needs are different. And I think that's what we have to get the mindset. It's not about treating everybody equally. It's treating people unequally as per their needs.
That comes back to that communication. Is it informal? Is it formal? And can systems, technology enable the communication to happen more and give you insights to affect positive change at an individual level? From a lot of the work we've been doing, seems over half of them are using surveys, biannual surveys. And I just feel with how things are moving now and how quickly people's sentiment changes, you've got to really start engaging in different ways and getting those pulse surveys or sentiment analysis, which I mentioned earlier. And then again, reviewing that by country, by job function, by what is the personality trait you think of that individual. Obviously being very, very aware that trust and trustworthiness comes back into it, is that big brother. And actually, is my organization that I'm employed by looking after my best needs as well as extracting the value that I can bring for that business outcome, which you mentioned. And that's that view of what is the outcome we need to get to, rather than how do we achieve an activity. It's like, what is it we actually want to achieve at the end of the day that will benefit both the employee, the individual, and the organization?
Yeah, I think sentiment tools have a great role to play, and they're a fantastic way to get a pulse on the crowd. But sentiment tools fall short around a particular individual. So they shouldn't be a substitute for individual check-ins with people. And I think effective management and managerial practices implements sentiment tools, get a sense of where the crowd is. It's an early detection as to the pulse of your group or the pulse of the broader community that's relevant for you. But when it comes to one-to-one, there's just no substitute for a quick personal check-in, as in, how are you doing? And listen to the answer. How am I doing? And listen to the answer. And then, how are we doing? And listen to that answer. And that third question of how are we doing will expose if there's any particular issues with managerial relationships with people that they're managing. And the principles of effective management haven't changed. It's one-to-one. Great leaders somehow make and help people feel like they're connected one-to-one with that leader, and that leader understands them. And in the remote world, we spend a lot of our remote time task-oriented. We now need to, as people return back to this new workplace, this post-pandemic workplace and workforce, we need to make sure that we also put back in some of the relationship elements that have been sacrificed, I think, with some of our behaviors around keeping the ship going, keeping continuity, etc., and keeping on task. How do we get back to some of the softer elements of management of others and management of teams, and that check-in, that individual check-in with people? And bringing it back to fundamentals of almost back to being human in the workplace.
Thank you for listening to the NTT Health and Wellbeing Podcast. For additional resources and to continue this conversation, please visit www.global.ntt/health and wellbeing.